Kentucky counties do elections right. That's the topic of this panel. And just so everyone has an idea where we're going to go with this, I want to talk a little bit about this year's election, some of the legislative successes, and some of the challenges that Kentucky counties have in the future. So Secretary Adams, it seems like the place to start with you. Could you give us a breakdown of this year's election, how it went?
Well, I think it went really smooth in 119 of 120 counties. We had a snag in Jefferson County early in the morning. Their e-poll books weren't powered on early enough to process. And so that led to some delays in some of the voting locations in Jefferson. But really, if you grade on a curve, I think we had the best elections in the country. For one, other places had hotter tempers. You had bomb threats being called into voting locations, them being evacuated. We had none of that. We were fully prepared for any contingency. We spend months preparing for any sort of security issue. We had none of that. And even in Jefferson, where we had lines of people with red hats and blue T-shirts on, everyone was very chill, got along great, kept their tempers. And that's really important these days, and you can't take it for granted. So it was a smooth election. We had high turnout, and we counted quickly. And we were the first state declared in the presidential race that evening. And I think folks like to know whether their candidate wins or loses, who won and lost, and go home and get some sleep, and we did that.
You say there are months of preparation. What does that look like leading up to the election so you know what's happening on Election Day?
Well, I think the clerks could agree with this, and my predecessors could too. We work more than 2 days a year. We don't just work on the 2 election days. It's a year-long enterprise. It's lots of work done during the legislative session to ensure adequate funding, to improve the laws and the processes. It's a lot of training. We've had an influx of new people becoming poll workers, and that's not just good, that's critical to make sure we have enough locations, but also means constant training. There's a whole lot of information to have to convey to get people ready. It's also security preparations. We've tried to step up not just the federal and state cooperation, but also the federal and local cooperation, because the federal government has resources and personnel that can go scope out voting locations and in our courthouses and make sure they're adequately secure.
Clerk Clemons, I'll turn to you. A more narrow view. What did this election look like at a county level?
So I think from our county clerks, this election looked like a lot of preparation, a lot of stress leading to that preparation, and a lot of teamwork. You know, there's 120 county clerks, but there's hundreds of deputy county clerks who carry on the torch for us to be able to be successful on Election Day. And we certainly would be remiss if we didn't mention them today. Equally, our poll workers, preparing poll workers, ensuring that they have adequate training and they have the resources and the familiarity to be able to call your office and ask the question that they need to ask correctly. Some of the barriers is just getting them to ask the correct question and finding the right answer. So, but overall, I'm proud of Kentuckians for showing up to vote. You know, in small and large counties, we were very busy. Having the 3 days of early voting certainly helps eliminate some of the stress from Election Day. It is wonderful that we are now able to have early voting, and to the quantity that we can handle it. I feel like 3 days is adequate for Kentucky. But equally, I'm proud that we are able to be a state that can certify an election. You know, we're good at that in Kentucky. We do that right, and I'm proud of all 120 county clerks. As the president of the association this year, this has been an extremely stressful year. As Secretary mentioned, you know, the threats surrounding elections, that's not something I thought that I would deal with 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I was more worried about making sure I had 4 election officers showing up at a table to work and making sure they got to the right table in a gym that had 4 or 5 locations. So I think that, you know, as elections have evolved and in the direction that they've went, security was something that was of the utmost importance to all of us this election.
Bob and Trey, I'm hoping you two can play off of each other a little bit, because as former secretaries of state, you all have a unique perspective. How has Kentucky's election process changed since you two were in charge?
When I was secretary, we worked toward a major goal to have motor voter. It was sponsored by Wendell Ford, United States Senator from Kentucky. Bob Taft, Republican, Secretary of State of Ohio, later governor. Ford asked me to get with others and build the base to support that. Clerks were not exactly sure how that would work out, to put it kindly. but history says that it's worked exceedingly well. I certainly congratulate you on your term, Tabatha. You've done a fabulous job. And I would ask all of you to join me in thanking our outstanding Secretary of State, Michael Adams, for the job he just did.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So what's changed, I think, too, is the attitude. A dear friend of mine who was an election denier of the first order, we've had many discussions about this. I think it's been in 60 or 70 courts in America, and no proof yet in those settings. She elected to be an election worker, worked in her precinct, and then this time was a sheriff. Guess what? She concluded the Kentucky system is really good from what she learned and what she saw, and it is. Every Secretary of State before me worked together, particularly Bremer Earler from Louisville, did everything possible for me to be successful. I helped the guy who came after me, John Brown, and all of us have worked in succession to try to make the system absolutely certain, foolproof, and outstanding. It's better now than it's ever been. That's a matter of pride for our state and for our country, and I congratulate so many people who sacrificed on Election Day to carry it through. Those are the real heroes of this process.
You know, if we were gathered here 5 years ago, we wouldn't have had, the way the election went this year, we wouldn't have been able to talk about a lot of those changes. And I want to give credit to the Secretary and the Clerks Association, as well as the State Board of Elections and Governor Beshear, because during 2020, when we were hit with this global pandemic, the General Assembly passed a law that modified a law we got passed. So when I was Secretary, 9/11 was a primary election day in New York City. We'd had a terrorist attack in Spain on Election Day. And so we got a law passed that gave the governor the ability, with the Secretary of State, to postpone an election in the case of a declared emergency. When the pandemic hit, it wasn't clear that that law gave enough flexibility to run an election in a pandemic. So the legislature passed a law to give the Secretary, the governor, the ability to change not just the timing of an election, but the manner, and allow the State Board of Elections to promulgate those regulations. So Jared Daring, who at the time was the executive director of the State Board, Secretary Adams, Governor Beshear, worked together with the clerks to figure out how do you conduct an election in a pandemic. And a lot of the things that were done were things that other states had seen and we could learn from. Vote centers, allowing polling places to operate either ranging from, if it's 2 in one place, instead of having 2 lines, it's 1 line. And you could have all the poll workers work there, to countywide consolidation, to the early voting days and a portal, drop boxes so people don't have to rely upon the mail, which is very unreliable nowadays for those who can vote by mail because they have an excuse. So all that got tested out in 2020, and it worked pretty well. And so the Secretary went around and the clerks went around and said, hey, we should make some of this permanent. So over the last couple of years, that's when I re-entered the scene. The association hired me and my colleagues at Frost Brown Todd to represent the association. And it's been great the last 3 years, working, figuring out how to make things better. We passed a bill, then we tweaked the bill. We call it continuous improvements. Not cleanup, but continuous improvement. We're always continuously improving elections. And also working with CAECO and the judges and magistrates and commissioners to get funding. So no longer do we have any machines that are purely electronic. It's all paper. That had started a while ago. But the General Assembly, thanks to the lobbying efforts of folks in this room, got $25 million. The state had never given money like that before. And so it's become this real team effort. Even this year, one of the things that wasn't very visible was this new post-election audit that Representative Hodgson championed the last couple of years. And the clerks took the training upon themselves, conducted 2 Zoom sessions to really dive in and answer questions in a law that wasn't entirely clear and regulations that weren't entirely clear, to be able to run an audit so people could say, yeah, we checked the tech after the election. We checked it before and we checked it after, and guess what? It checked out. And so that was something that y'all may have seen, but a lot of voters didn't. But that was a great example of the association showing leadership and clerks helping clerks. And that's sort of how this all works, is we all help each other.
Can I add something real quick?
Absolutely.
So one thing that's changed, I think, from a historical perspective is when Bob and Trey were in office, they were given the benefit of the doubt. And the government was given the benefit of the doubt. Election officials were, in a way that's not happening today.
Yeah.
And so even though our laws are way better than they used to be, and our processes are way better than they used to be, there's less voter suppression. There's less fraud. Everything is much, much better. Yet there's still more doubt than there was before. And that's really, really frustrating. But I think one thing that's made Kentucky different and better than some of our other states is that we haven't let that drive policy. We've let common sense and facts drive policy.
Yeah. You went down a line I'd like to talk about, which is election misinformation. That's a huge issue. In fact, Kentucky had a notable instance of that in Laurel County with a ballot market machine that appeared to be working just fine, but someone posted a video on TikTok that was perhaps a little bit misleading. So, Secretary Adams, could you talk about, one, that issue specifically and how problems like that are addressed, but also this issue of misinformation and how you're working to address that?
So one shift over the last few years has been, we still see efforts to diminish confidence in our election process, but they're usually not homegrown. And increasingly, whether it's open records requests that we get, that I get, that Tabatha and the clerks get, whether it's urban legends on Twitter, these things tend to come from outside of our state. And that means they're not organic. They're not coming from people here who vote here, who know how we do it. It's coming from people who don't know a thing about us. And it's not just the right that does this. The left does it too. My first year was 2020, and we were the first state to have an election, or one of the first to have an election once the pandemic had started. And the first two that went before us just didn't pull it off very well. They didn't really have the experience that we fortunately got to watch them have and learn from. But there was an effort on Twitter called All Eyes on Kentucky. That was the hashtag. And they accused us of voter suppression and all this awful stuff. And we got way more abuse from the left in 1 year than we got from the right then or since. So unfortunately, this is a bipartisan problem. But it tends to be people who don't live here, who don't know a thing about our state. It can be that they say, oh, well, look, Mitch McConnell stole his election. He's really unpopular, but he gets these landslides. It must be vote fraud in Kentucky or voter suppression in Kentucky. It can be from the right, too. We've seen every variety. The good news here is when it comes from out of state, people don't necessarily pick up on it and buy it. When it comes from a Twitter account called Cat Turd, fortunately, Kentuckians are a bit dubious of that. They're not everywhere else. When it's TikTok, when it's social media, it's not as persuasive in a state that's candidly not super wired. And so my office did a survey recently of where people get their information. And fortunately, Kentuckians are more traditional in where they get their information and whom they trust for information. On primary election day last year, I was on the ballot running again. And we were about 1 o'clock in the afternoon on election day. And Carrie Lake put out a false tweet about things happening that weren't actually happening. And it got no traction. I thought I'd spend the rest of the day dealing with that. No one called. The media didn't call. Voters didn't call. They just ignored it. And really, we got very little from within our state after the TikTok thing. It was really a flash in the pan. So that video, as of Friday afternoon before the election, had 19 million views on TikTok. I guarantee you 18.99 million of them were outside Kentucky. We just ignored it. So I think Kentuckians have seen, they've seen this stuff, they've seen it in the news, but they've taken it with a grain of salt. And I think part of that is because we've been bipartisan in how we do this stuff. We don't just have a Democratic version or Republican version of voting. We work collaboratively on it. And also because people trust the clerks so much. And when they go vote, they know their poll workers usually, and they know the clerk. We have small counties, people know their local officials. And if you notice, the nature of conspiracy theorizing is it's always some distant elite. It's the governor or the Secretary of State or Washington or Europe or George Soros, right? It's never people in my own community. So I think it helps Kentucky that we lean more into the local presence here. And those are our faces of trust.
And I think that brings up a great point because Pew Research just released a study. 60% of people are nervous about how democracy is operating. But 3/4 of those same people polled said that they trust their local election officials. Mm-hmm. So how do we bring that local level up and make everyone feel confident about elections across the state?
Well, I think that that's a difficult task, right? Because each of us, whether we're in Ohio County or we're in Anderson County or Grant County, we have our family, friends, supporters who are going to back us and make sure that our message is shared. But yet we have all of these forces, like the Secretary said, from outside of Kentucky, outside of our region, that tries to infiltrate
what we actually know that happens. So I think one goal that I set during this last election season was that when there was misinformation shared, I was going to combat it. I wasn't going to take a back seat to it anymore because I had done that for a good while. And talking with other election officials across the country, I'm part of a group that has been meeting and convening over the last several months, and talking with them, that's a way to support them as well, because things that happen here in Kentucky, like the viral video, similar things were happening in other states. And while we're so busy checking off our to-do list and making sure that all the supplies are in the cart, all the machines are set and ready to go, the last thing we want to do at home at night is check Twitter, right? That's the last thing that I want to do because it's going to keep me up all night. But I felt like during this election season, we have to be on the forefront. We can no longer take a back seat and ignore or try to just wish it away. We're going to have to be on the forefront and have those difficult conversations and tell people that they're wrong. And that's a hard thing to do when you're an elected official. You know, you're depending on them to vote on you. So when you have a mayor of a small town sharing the picture of a ballot that has a dot next to somebody's name, and you stand up for your county board of elections to a mayor in your own county, which I did 2 days before the election. It's a difficult conversation to have, but he wanted to have it online, so we did it online. And sometimes you have to take the fight. You know, you have to, as our opening speaker said, you have to face adversity. So I think that that's how we combat it.
So one of the things Tabatha alluded to was a national group that she's involved with to share best practices. That's one of the big things that's happened in the election world across the country over the last few years, is there are a lot more conversations among local administrators across the country, as well as state officials, Secretary of States like Secretary Adams, as well as state election directors, sharing best practices, sharing how do you talk about this. So the County Clerks Association on its website has a 2-page document on why you can trust elections in Kentucky, and it goes through all the things that we do. But that framework is actually something that every state does. And this is something that more, as the Secretary and Tabatha mentioned, that what happens in another state impacts Kentucky. And so we can't just say, well, it's all good here, but I don't know about over there. We need to do our part in the elections world to kind of combat that misinformation. And you don't have to know exactly how Arizona does elections or Ohio does elections to be able to say, look, every state has voter registration, authenticates voters when they go vote, has bipartisan teams of neighbors at the polling place, counting the ballots in front of the press, in front of the political parties and the candidates. There's certification of voting equipment. We don't connect them to the internet. They vote on paper. There's a test of the machines before the election. There's a test after the election. There's recounts and audits and recanvasses and contests. And ultimately, if you're a bad guy or girl, we're going to put you in jail. All of that is true in every state in America. And that's, we can take this confidence that folks have in their local elections in our own state and say, hey, I trust, because that framework exists in every state. Well, yeah, that state may have a little bit more of a vote by mail than us, or they might do this a little bit differently. That whole framework of security exists. And that's something that we're trying to do our part to help that national conversation in the election space.
Yeah. Bob, all of these issues get nationalized, but the truth is, this year's Kentucky ballot, there was only one national election. Everything is statewide, countywide. What can we do to bring these state issues back to the forefront as opposed to making everything nationalized?
Back in my day, we had an election fraud task force that dealt with some situations. There were death threats toward me and others at that time, and serious stuff. So come forward with that. We seem to have this focus around the country for election integrity. We had a very misguided effort, in my opinion, made by a couple of prominent folks a couple of years back. Election integrity raises the question that there's not integrity, and that was their purpose. I think they failed significantly. One was running for re-election for a state Senate seat, ran third in that primary, in part a message from her base, her voters, that didn't stand up. there are other
We can
states that
say her
probably
name
has.
is Adrian Southworth.
What they?
We can say her name is Adrian Southworth.
We can. I was trying to be more polite. Trey was my intern, so he corrects me a lot.
Bob was my boss and taught me to think for myself. So.
We both served our terms, then went on to the great unknown world of lobbying, and still stick together on KET with Renee Shaw. A brief promotion there. And you. Collectively, we have to make the investment in this. It's just, there are many competing investments, like local government and local officials. I was one before I was a state official. We have needs that supersede elections. It's just not a sexy topic. Unless you have someone this good looking promoting it, then you can. And that we have made changes systematically is a good thing, a good step. But I don't imagine a whole lot of states can beat us at performing elections. We have to maintain that, stick with it. Just because it's good today doesn't mean it always would be. But this is a system that we can be proud of. And for local officials, you don't want the problem of an election error of any sort. Even when the Louisville problem hit, we came to a screeching halt, did we not? How bad is it? What's it going to mean, particularly for you? And fortunately, it was not that significant.
Secretary Adams, of course, misinformation is a huge issue, but there are other issues to be concerned about. One thing you talked about before the election was the number of polling locations and the availability of polling workers. Is that something that you saw improved itself this election cycle, and how do you address it in the future?
So when I was first elected, I was invited to testify before a legislative committee about what I wanted to do after I took the job. And I warned them in November of 2019 that we had a crisis brewing in having enough poll workers. COVID didn't help with that, actually. But this is not an election problem per se. It's a social problem of the disappearance of the ethos of giving back, volunteering, serving others. And we just see generation by generation more and more decline in volunteering. It's not just this. It's the PTA. It's giving blood. It's all kinds of stuff. And this is just something that we've got to figure out how to manage. And so the clerks have worked hard. I've worked hard to ring the bell, make the public aware that we can't take this for granted, that we need help. Fortunately, we saw a big bump in interest this year. When you have a bump in interest in the election, you get more voter registrations. You also get more volunteer poll workers. So that problem largely solved itself. We tried to help solve it too, but fortunately we were in a good position for this. But I'd still say long term, the biggest challenge to our elections is this. It's not misinformation or conspiracy theories. Those are annoying, but the biggest threat is actually this, because it's the hardest to solve. And it's a dual problem. One problem is if you have fewer personnel, that just means fewer locations, right? The other problem, though, is the locations. Increasingly, the locations don't want to be locations. We had to fight in this last session to make the law very clear that the clerks could compel the school boards to make those school buildings available as voting locations. And they've not been very happy about that, candidly. Usually the school is about the best place to put a voting location. It's a big space with a lot of parking, right? The locations are usually good. So they make perfect voting locations. Increasingly, the private locations are making off churches. Coming out of the abortion amendment on the ballot a couple of years ago, a lot of them said, we're done. We don't want people coming on our premises and voting a different way than we believe. So they're checking out. So, something else I learned is just touring the state as a candidate and as a public official, our infrastructure is not very good in some places. There are places where I can't go to a Lincoln dinner for that county Republican Party because there's not a restaurant or there's not a gathering place. So they have to have their event in some other neighboring county. And it makes you think, like, we've got to have strong communities for lots of reasons, for social cohesion, right? For social mobility. We've got to have a way where people don't feel isolated and find solace in drugs. We need gathering places locally, and it would help us run the elections smoothly as well, but we need to be thinking about that.
Clerk Clemons, what would help at the local level for you and for other county clerks?
So I've talked about this numerous times, but funding is an issue. 90% of all of the funds to support our elections is from our county budgets. It's from our local tax dollars. And until we have real buy-in from the state perspective, while they gave $25 million to replace equipment, we still have to fund everything else that goes along with that election. And funding continues to be an issue. You know, in my county, we pay $165 for a poll worker for a 14-hour day and 2 hours of training. So they've invested that time. They want to do it. I'm excited for them to do it. We try to make it special. But at the end of the day, there's a county that's neighboring to me that can't pay that. And then there's a county south of me that pays more than me. So it's the same day, and our election officers, no matter which county they're in, should be adequately, compensated for their time. And equally, our fiscal court shouldn't be on the hook for the expense of an election when we have all sorts of candidates on the election: national candidates, state candidates, county candidates, city candidates, school board candidates, soil and water conservation. I mean, it's a whole gamut of things, but we're the ones who are funding it constantly. And 90% of that is coming on the backs of our county budget. So we need to look at that and see if there's more of a holistic approach to funding elections in the state of Kentucky.
Secretary Adams, I think that one of the other things that people are discussing are the legislative successes of Kentucky. The fact that Kentucky has had a number of bills passed that have broadened the ability of people to go vote, have done election security measures. You've had a large part in that. Why do you think people are looking to Kentucky, and what else can Kentucky do?
Well, I think Kentucky has chosen to be different and better in that we've been fact-based and rational, and we've been nonpartisan or bipartisan. And we have a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature, and that creates a little more space for doing this in a nonpartisan, non-ideological way. If you go to a red state, you're just going to have one party writing their version of the elections. If you go to a blue state, you're going to get the same. When we have both sides, it means both sides are willing to give a little and get a little. And I think that's good for public confidence. If you saw what happened in Georgia a few years ago, on the merits, the law was quite reasonable. But because it was Republicans forcing through a curtailing of voting days, there were boycotts and backlash. They lost the All-Star game. It was just a nightmare. And they had more early voting than we do. But we never got any of that. We got the opposite because we've handled it in a different way tonally. And we also, one other difference is in a lot of states, a lot of the ideas for election laws come from think tanks or special interest groups. And we really haven't done it that way here. The election legislation gets written up by Trey and Tabatha and me and legislators, county clerks. We all sit down, we think about how to do it better, and that's where this comes from. So that's the way it should be done. It should be election officials working with the legislators and not special interest groups writing these things.
Casey, I think a standout example was Michael Adams leaving that corner office, walking down to room 100 and working out with the governor how we could vote at that time relatively easily and in a very positive way. It's a terrific example of collaboration and looking out for the rest of us. You know, county clerks have a hard job. It is a hard damn job. It's packed. It's a lot of work on your part, and elections are just a part of it. I remember a few years ago, Secretary Grimes had a ceremony in the rotunda for poll workers who'd served a long time, 25, 30, 35, 40 years, maybe even longer. That's remarkable. We could do that locally, kind of seizing on Commissioner Schell's energy, just to thank folks beyond $165, recognize them at a fiscal court meeting or some other celebration, and encourage them and encourage other people to do it. It's a hard job to recruit thousands, but locally we could get more, perhaps if we try. What do you think, Trey?
Yes, boss. I also wanted to, the clerks I think are leaning in and keeping lists of things that don't make sense or problems with the law. But I also want to give a shout out. There have been a couple key legislators that have really played a big role. Foremost now, as it's sort of worked out, is Jennifer Decker, who represents Shelby County. She was brought into the original conversation because when we had our big meeting in 2021, Senator Paul had some interest in election, and he asked her to come in and represent his interests. And she, outgoing Elections Committee Chairman Kevin Bratcher in the House, James Allen Tipton, and Josh Branscombe, who formerly was on the State Board of Elections. The House is where a lot of this comes out of. Part of that's because you have an elections committee, so it's easier to get in. But that group, and particularly Representatives Decker, and now relatively new member, John Hodgson from Jefferson County here. They have really done a great job with this. And then working out a lot of the details and going to the Senate and working with Robbie Mills, who's been state and local chair the last couple of years, that has been really helpful, having folks who understand, and because they've been doing it year after year after year, they know a lot more about election administration than their colleagues. And it's a challenge because all legislators think they know a lot about elections and that elections work because they won, right? Like, actually, all you want, although the elections worked really well worked for me a couple times, didn't work so well that third time. But, it worked really well, right? Right candidate won, best candidate won. And so we're trying to explain, how do you change elections in this environment? And those legislative leaders, they go talk to their colleagues, they tell us what is possible, what isn't possible. And there's just been a lot of trust that's been developed, and I think they deserve a real shout out.
Trey, I'm going to go right back to you. Did you have something to say? Is because these issues evolve as time evolves. 2016, it was outside interference.
Yeah.
2020, it was the actual vote count. And as election officials continue to make adjustments as these problems shift, we continue to solve a lot of them. So could you give some perspective on how things have continued to change and how they continue to be addressed?
Yeah, I think one of the things is there's a couple trends. One is this growth in technology that has made things possible. So I'm a poll worker, election worker on the Saturday of early voting in Boone County where I live. And because, thanks to the ID law, 99% of, this is the first time somebody checked in without an ID and he had a passport. We just scan the barcode, boom, person pops up. We know exactly who they are, where they're registered. It's made check-in a lot more efficient, more secure, and we get data. We can find out what time of days are the peak. So that'll help with election planning. And so that technology has really helped. I think understanding the need to keep elections, the ballots on paper. We had this period of time where we didn't use, like the big old lever machines, they had paper, but that next generation that looked like lever machines did not have paper. And then the accessible machines originally didn't have paper. We went back to paper. But there are some timeless principles, that bipartisanship, that transparency. Those are timeless and are never going to change. And I think in Kentucky, what we've been focused on is what works best for Kentucky. How do we run our elections in Kentucky? And I wanted early voting back when I was in office. We couldn't get it through. The pandemic was a natural experiment. It worked pretty well, and the voters liked it. And I think one of the things that we were just talking about before coming on stage is my suspicion is we're going to see a lot more voters going forward take advantage of early voting because they did it this year and liked it. It was crickets a lot of times on those Thursday, Friday, Saturdays prior to this election. But now that you scheduled when it's convenient for you to vote, why would you go back? And so the challenge again for the counties is that creates uncertainty for planning. What are your reasons? We know we'll have lower turnout, but where will that turnout turn out? And so, for the next couple of years, we're going to work through that transition. But it's I think embracing and leaning into these innovations has been really positive for elections.
Secretary Adams, I want to go back to something Bob mentioned much earlier, and that was about threats of violence. That was something that happened to your office this year. How do you all prepare for that, and how do we bring the temperature down a little bit to prevent it in the future?
Well, it's not just election officials, and I've gone on my way to say there's something unique about us and what we're doing that's generating this. It's health workers, it's the governor, the AG, everyone in public life gets these. School board members get them. We just have a violent culture right now. So I don't think I'm unique or uniquely challenged by these things. It's just part of life, unfortunately, today. I have had great conversations with the governor and with the state police and the FBI, and I have every confidence that they're going to keep all of us safe. Usually it's just people blowing off steam and they're not serious. I got death threats when I was just an attorney doing political law. My name would be in a disclaimer on an ad and people would call and threaten to kill me over that. So I'm kind of used to people acting out. But I do think this is taken very seriously at every level of government. And so I feel very safe.
Yeah. Clerk Clemons, the same question goes for you. How do you prepare your staff for election season and the rise in temperatures that you might see?
Well, I think that you first have to think one of the roles of the county clerk's office is to collect taxes. There's a lot of things that people get angry about. One is tax collection. They come in, they want to renew a vehicle, and some back taxes come up on something they sold. They're immediately angry. And so we're we're kind of accustomed to dealing with that, but not in the scale that is faceless. You know, we're used to that face-to-face contact. We know that person. We know they blow off steam. We know that they have some other things going on in their life. But when we get to the realm of elections and the space that has come in with social media, that threat becomes very different. And how you respond to that threat becomes different. And having our federal partners at the FBI and CISA and all of the networking that we've done over the last few years really helped prepare clerks to face those threats. You know, some face the threat of the viral videos and what transpired after the viral videos. But then there's also those of us who had to, face other threats, things being mailed to our home, checking our mail at home with gloves on. I mean, when I ran for clerk 11 years ago, I've been clerk 10 years, I didn't think that I would ever check my mail at home with gloves on or tell my children they couldn't go check our mailbox. And that happened. We had to be vigilant. And I think that keeping your eye on the ball and making sure that you're aware but not fearful is a delicate balance.
Despite challenges, despite differences, I think what we heard today is Kentucky counties do elections right, and we'll continue to improve over time. So I hope everyone will take a second and say thank you to these wonderful panelists. They did a great job.
Good job, sir. Great job. How about you?